anyway, it's a great read because he has really done careful research, and he visited every round barn in Indiana, took pictures of it, and told its history. Here's one with a clear story tier between the roofs. Yet another variation. This one's on, I believe it's on Highway 31. So if you travel up and down toward Indianapolis on Highway 31, you'll go past this one. Decorating shingles has become very popular. I should also say that some round barns are basement barns, meaning that they have a full foundation. Some are bank barns, which means that they're ramped into the second floor or third floor. There are occasionally, the one that I showed you back here, that's a 4-story barn. This one has a ramp on this side and then a ramp around to the right. You can just see the ramp there. We gave them a grant to rebuild these ramps because you couldn't drive into the barn anymore. One of them goes into one floor and one goes up to the next floor and then drives around a sloping ramp to the top floor. So you can actually drive your horse and wagon all the way up into the top, of the barn. So they encompass several different variations. But it's very difficult to find one built after 1920. I won't say there are none, but they're rare. They're very rare. Actually, one of our contractors who we recommend to barn owners, an Amish contractor I think he's out of Lagodi. He just built himself a new round barn. So it's not like nobody wants them. This is a very nice one. So I didn't used to talk about this because modern barns, contemporary barns built, let's just say in my lifetime, I was born in 1945, and back another 25 years, are rarely talked about as historic barns, but they're, some of them are 100 years old, so they're clearly historic barns. Anything, by the way, in preservation that's 50 years old or older is considered eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So as you see, as time goes by, more and more is included in that. So these are sometimes called lumber barns or lumber truss barns, or called plank truss barns or plank framed barns. They're not built out of timbers. They're built out of 2x6s and 2x4s, and they're basically balloon framed or platform framed barns that are built the same way that most houses are built today. Partly this evolved because we deforested our country. By 1890, there were almost no timber forests left in the country. And so you just couldn't go out and cut down the trees big enough to build a barn. And by the way, earlier I was given a tour of this place, and there's a beautiful forest out this way if you haven't ever been in it. And it actually has trees in it big enough to build a barn from. But it's very rare to see poplar trees that two people can't reach around, but there are some here. In any case, the plank barn or the plank truss barn offers a lot of advantages because they're quick to build, they're fairly inexpensive. They came at a time when lumber was coming from the lumber mill instead of out of somebody's woods. And a lot of the barns that you see in the landscape today that are, especially the gambrel roof barns, are plank framed. And if you go in them, you look for the timbers like you would see in a barn like this, and they're just not there. The advantage is that they have clear span lofts, so there's nothing in the way on the inside. And frequently they'll have a floor span system that goes all the way from one side to the other. So there are no posts.
You have the hay rail on the top, just like you were describing, up there. And we still have pieces for that if you want them. I can provide them. I don't think we'll be using them again. So we put it together back here. Initially just storage and that kind of stuff. Now with the park, we're trying to utilize it for other things too.
So I didn't really talk about ground barns, G-R-O-U-N-D, because it just seems obvious to me. I never think about them as being distinct. But ground barns are built right on the ground.
So they might have a foundation, but it would be very low. And they're basically meant to be able to drive a wagon right onto the floor. They don't have a basement under for cattle or for animals. And they're very, very common. So the very first, if you remember, I showed you that farm scene where all the barns are there and the house is there and so on. The little English barn that sits on that farm is a 3-bay English barn. That's the earliest traditional English barn I've ever seen in Indiana. I mean, it looks exactly like they do in 1500 Scotland. And this is that same barn with variation. It's not a 3-bay barn, it's a 4-bay barn. So all they did was add one more bay, which is space between the timbers. So there's one more bent in this barn than in the very original barn. Do you know the date this barn was built?
I do not.
This is a sawn barn, it's not timber frame. So the very earliest it could be was probably in the 1880s, maybe the late 1870s, but it could very well be 1900 also. I didn't say, I was talking to somebody else on the way up here, but little known fact about historic barns. Most barns extant in Indiana were built between 1900 and 1920. So, and the most barns of Indiana, if you go back with the inventories that we have, we built more barns in Indiana from 1900 to 1920 than had been built in all the years before or since. So that's the height of agricultural development in Indiana. And there were 30,000 barns that we know of. There are now 3,000. So that's why we have a barn foundation, because we don't want there to be any less than 3,000. So what you're doing, thank you. You know, it's great. Save them any way you can. And if you can't, find somebody who might be able to.
Loft, or as they got taller, as time went by, they would have a partial loft, or sometimes they'd have a loft here on this side of the floor and there on that side of the floor. And then occasionally you'll see one with a higher loft floor across the threshing opening. So you would step up maybe 3 feet to a higher floor. It was just raised so you could get your equipment in and out. So, but most of them were just open. On ours, we have an English barn from the 1830s, and it's a single story. It's lower than this. It didn't have any loft in it, originally built. And unfortunately, the quarry company that owned the property before we did had gone into the barn and cut out a lot of the infrastructure because they wanted to store equipment, these big pumps, mobile pumps in there. So they had taken out a lot of the tie beam and dirt braces. So when we got it, it was sort of leaning like this, and then slowly over 20 years went more and more like that, and we straightened it up. And we actually put a loft in it so we could straighten it and pull it back together. So this, again, these are bents, and these are called cross tie beams. And each bent is usually the same. This one here doesn't have a tie beam associated with it. I'm not really quite sure why. And neither does the other one. Although they do have what are called cross girts, which are those sort of 2x4 sized pieces that are basically bracing the bent so that it can't go from side to side. That's just an engineering. So farmers, if they had a cord group in there, that would make the end tie very solid and hard for the barn to move. So any way you could tie it together, you would, and they're customized for use. You know. So this barn also has transfer stores. So I don't know if they were always there. They look like from the 4x4 posts, they look like they might have been added at some point, but at some point the threshing barn wasn't as practical as maybe they wanted it to be, and so they added an end door to it. And you see that is fairly common. It's very low, so they weren't probably moving wagons in and out, but they didn't care about bringing a wagon full of hay. The reason these doors are so tall is because your hay wagon was a couple of stories tall by the time you got it loaded. So this is all pretty typical. The mortise and tenon formation, the bracing, the pins that are used that go into the timbers. You can see here there was a cross girt of some kind,
but it's not copied on this side. So I don't
Some of
know.
these were replaced.
Sorry?
Some of the columns and
Some of
these
them
were
are
replaced.
new beams.
Yeah.
Okay, or taken from another barn.
Another barn, yeah.
So that makes it a little hard to read exactly how they usually conform. But if they haven't been changed, you can usually read the way it was originally, even if it's been altered. The most damage you can do to a barn like this is to take the corner braces out. Those don't seem that important, but they are. So sometimes you'll see on a bent, you'll see, especially if there's no loft, you'll see what's called a double H bent, which has a tie beam at the top, and then it'll have another tie beam in the middle, and then another one right above the middle one. So there will be a pair of them to stiffen the barn, because there's no flooring to help stiffen it. So if you have a loft and you nail down all that flooring, it makes the whole thing stiff and the barn won't move. So the bracing is important. So sometimes you'll see double tie beams, but based on the frequency of the posts here, they're fairly close together. I'd say this is a pretty old barn. It's built, at least it's built by somebody who understood an older form. Because the newer ones, the posts tend to be farther apart and the tie beams bigger. So I did notice that the tie beams in this barn up high, I was talking about that should be the bigger piece. They're really not any bigger than the ones through the middle. So the engineer, whoever engineered this barn, wasn't taking a precaution about wind load. They either didn't think it was going to be an issue or they didn't know any better. And it's not that uncommon to see.
Still standing.
There are a lot of sort of very typical, when I was talking about angled purlin, purlin is this beam that runs the length of the barn, and the reason it's there is the rafters break on it, so there's a rafter below it and a rafter above it, and they're tied together there, and then they're supported from the tie beam underneath by two angled braces. And this is a pretty typical way to do it. One main brace, which is bigger, goes right under the purlin, and then a slightly smaller one braces the brace. So you've created a triangle, and that's super strong. So, and this, he said this had a track in it. The track's still there. Yeah. And so that left that open. So you could move hay through between those. With the angle braces, you have a lot more room, and the people who were doing the work would go back and forth. You would pile hay up on the loft, and then you would work on top of it, right? So sometimes you'll see ladders. I don't know what happened here exactly, but you'll see ladders that go up into nowhere, and they're way up in the top of a 2 or 3 story barn, and they just end. And people are like, well, why would they have a ladder that doesn't go anywhere? Well, that's how you got down after you usually you had your kids up there, and they couldn't get out any other way. And sometimes you'll see them closeted, so there's a framework around them that kept the hay from smothering the ladder, so you could, safely get in. You didn't want to, lose a child in fresh hay. And there's no ventilation on this barn, which also tells me that they probably weren't using it to store anything that had to be kept dry. They probably didn't have animals in it.
I don't think so.
Yeah. And its style, at least, predates the so-called agricultural scientific revolution. So it's an old form. It's a pretty old form. Nice shape. Did they have to do a lot of work to it?
I think this column was added.
This one?
Okay, yeah, that's what the ladder's here. I think they put that in there because it had it on there originally. It was probably, more against a loft.
Yeah, that's the typical way to do it. And not all barns have ladders in them, but they almost never have stairs in them. The ones that
we added that. So.
Yeah, the ones that have staircases are the basement barns, because you have to be able to get upstairs because there's no ramp. So you always see a staircase in those, but otherwise you almost never see. They didn't want to take up room with stairs.
Right. That barn down there had a very narrow, steep staircase in it.
Yeah, just barely utilitarian.
Yeah.
And then is it common to have call it a hatch going through the upper level to have drop down hang and everything down?
If they're feeding animals below, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And in basement barns, Pennsylvania Dutch barns, any barn that is raising animals and feeding them below usually has some kind of drop. And sometimes they'll have a separating wall. There's a name for it, I lost it, but a masonry wall that separates the animal areas. It was usually a place to throw the manure. So if you got so much manure so quickly, if you had animals in the barn, then you had to do something with it. And you wanted it for your fields, but they didn't like to store it outside because it would bleach out, basically. It would blanch from the weather. So it would lose its nutrient over time. Now you see plenty of pictures of working barns with huge piles of manure outside of them, so don't get me wrong. But if they could, they kept it inside the barn. But they didn't want to keep it where the animals were. And if you're the person shoveling the shit, then you had to have a place to put it. And so you'll see these sort of stone bins. But then you had to eventually you'd fill that up, and you had to get, so sometimes you'll see low windows or they're not doors that go all the way to the ground, they're just high windows. And they were used for just throwing the stuff out there. So, and it was, it was a big deal to have to shovel all that. It was heavy, it's wet, it stinks, and you had to get it out of the way. You couldn't raise animals healthily if they're knee deep. So it was really a big commitment to raise animals because of that.